During the pre-departure sweep of the inner motor bay, the guard noticed a thin adhesive pad beneath the rear seat rail of the Queen's vehicle. It was new. It did not belong to any logged equipment. He paused, hand still, listening to the quiet hum of the generators. Protocol required sealing and reporting. Instinct warned that movement itself might trigger something. The motorcade clock kept running. The guard had completed the exterior sweep twice already, his breath steady in the cold air of the inner motor bay, the concrete holding the night's chill despite the overhead lights humming at full output. And it was only because protocol demanded a final interior verification that he crouched again beside the rear door, fingers brushing the seat rail where fabric met metal, where nothing should have changed since the vehicle was sealed the previous evening. Yet the resistance he felt was wrong, slight but deliberate, a pressure that did not belong to the car's original construction. And when he angled his torch beneath the seat, his beam caught a thin square of matte black adhesive fixed just out of casual sight, too clean to be debris, too precise to be accidental. And the silence in the bay thickened as he froze, counting 3 breaths without moving, aware of the motorcade schedule ticking in his head, aware of the Queen's principal aide standing 10 meters away reviewing departure times, aware that nothing in his training allowed for assumptions, only verification. And yet this object was not in the maintenance log, not in the overnight security report, not in the authorized equipment register he had signed off on less than an hour earlier. And his hand hovered, not touching, because instinct warned him that pressure, vibration, or removal could change the situation in ways protocol could not yet predict. So he rose slowly, signaled a pause with 2 fingers held low at his side, and watched the nearest driver stiffen in response, the signal understood even before it was questioned, as the guard stepped back from the vehicle and requested a time hold through his throat mic, voice level, wording exact, using the phrase that converted routine movement into controlled delay. And the response came back sharper than expected, asking for cause, for clarity, for confirmation that this was not another overextension of caution. And he gave only what he had, an undocumented device discovered during sweep, location rear passenger compartment, status unknown. And the pause that followed was longer than regulation allowed, broken finally by footsteps as senior staff approached, expressions tight with the knowledge that delays had political weight, that timetables were not suggestions but commitments. And when they demanded to know why the car was not already rolling, he met their eyes without defiance, stating only that he was assuming responsibility for the hold, that until the device was identified, the vehicle would remain static, that no principal would enter, and that his name could be logged against the decision. And the temperature in the bay seemed to drop as the aide reminded him, quietly, that the Queen was already en route to the loading corridor, that media clearance windows did not bend easily, that internal security had signed off hours ago. And the guard listened, hands still, gaze fixed on the sealed door, aware that once the next step was taken, there would be no reversal, only escalation. And behind him, the engines remained silent, waiting. The order to proceed came layered in procedural language rather than command, a suggestion framed as reassurance, internal security advising that unidentified did not automatically mean hostile, that the vehicle could be cleared at destination, that disruption at this stage carried unnecessary risk, and the guard acknowledged every word without yielding, requesting instead a technical unit and invoking controlled lockdown protocols that were rarely used this close to departure. And when the aide's jaw tightened, he felt it not as victory, but as pressure accumulating, because each additional minute created witnesses, records, questions that would outlive the moment, and he knew the shape of blame well enough to recognize how easily it could be redirected. Yet he also knew that once a principal entered a compromised space, the margin for correction collapsed entirely. So he stepped between the vehicle and the bay exit, not theatrically, simply occupying the line that could not be crossed without forcing an overt override. And that restraint mattered because it placed the burden of escalation elsewhere, forcing any authority above him to make the next move visible. And while voices gathered behind him, he keyed a secondary channel, logging the discovery with timestamp and image capture, careful to frame the device without touching it, the adhesive's edges sharp and new, the wiring minimal but intentional. And when the technical officer finally arrived, his face showed the same restrained concern as the torch beam traced the pad's outline, confirming what the guard already knew, that this was not standard tracking hardware, that it drew power intermittently, that removal without isolation was not advised, and the aide exhaled slowly, recalculating, shifting from dismissal to containment, asking how long, how visible, how quiet the resolution could be kept, and the guard answered only what was certain, that the vehicle was compromised, that a replacement must be brought forward, that the Queen's route would need adjustment, and that all subsequent passengers scheduled for this car must be reassigned until clearance was complete. And it was at that moment, as the revised manifest was pulled up on a tablet nearby, that a line item caught his attention, a secondary occupant listed later in the day, under the same vehicle configuration, a young royal whose movements were usually minimized, protected by redundancy rather than speed. And the significance landed without drama, simply altering the weight of every previous objection, because this was no longer about inconvenience or optics, but about exposure repeated, normalized, and potentially unnoticed. And when he requested confirmation that the child's transport would also be suspended, the answer hesitated, wrapped in phrases about authorization chains and limited need to know, and the guard felt the boundary harden beneath his feet, the line between protocol followed and protocol questioned, and he logged the hesitation as carefully as the device itself, aware that the silence after his request carried more information than any order could, while somewhere beyond the bay the Queen's footsteps approached, measured and unaware, and the engines remained still, holding a tension that was no longer just mechanical. The replacement vehicle was rolled into position under harsher lighting, its paint still warm from storage, while the compromised car was sealed behind temporary barriers that made the motor bay feel smaller, more watched. And the guard remained present without standing at attention, posture neutral, eyes moving as command staff arrived in measured intervals, each one adding weight rather than noise, and the first assessment came quickly, technical officers suggesting the device was likely passive, perhaps an internal asset misfiled, perhaps a contractor error. And the guard listened without interruption, noting how carefully the language avoided certainty, how often it leaned on probability rather than fact. And when he asked whether the device was transmitting, the answer was delayed by a glance toward a supervisor before a qualified response confirmed intermittent signal bursts at irregular intervals, low power, masked but not inert. And that detail settled the matter internally, even as the room resisted externally, because transmission meant intent, and intent meant assumption was no longer an option. Yet the pressure increased subtly, not through raised voices but through proximity, through a senior official standing just within his peripheral vision, through reminders of cascading delays, of diplomatic schedules that would require explanation, of internal embarrassment if the incident escalated beyond the walls of the palace. And the guard acknowledged all of it while continuing to log, timestamps precise, phrasing neutral, knowing that documentation was not defiance, but insulation. And when the technical team requested permission to isolate the signal rather than remove the device, he approved without hesitation, watching as they worked with deliberate care, hands steady, shielding the area while monitors flickered with data that confirmed encryption beyond standard fleet tracking, and that confirmation shifted the tone again, narrowing options. Yet instead of clarity, it produced a new directive from command, suggesting compartmentalization, that only essential personnel remain informed, that the Queen's movement proceed under adjusted security while the issue was internally resolved. And the guard felt the shape of quiet pressure fully then, not a demand to ignore the problem, but an attempt to bound it, to keep it from touching other routes, other names. And when he asked whether the vehicle had ever been scheduled for use by non-principal occupants, the question was met with an answer that was technically correct but incomplete, stating only that assignments varied, and he requested the full manifest history for the day, a request that slowed the room further, because data once shared could not be unseen. And as the file populated, his attention narrowed to a single line, a child's name redacted to role rather than identity, time-stamped for later movement, same vehicle class, same seating configuration, and the air seemed to cool again, as he understood that whatever authority had placed the device had done so with patience, with knowledge of rotation rather than urgency, and that this moment was not an anomaly, but an interruption. The guard did not announce the discovery, did not point or raise his voice, but he adjusted his stance and requested confirmation that the child's movement be suspended pending review, and the response came carefully, framed as unnecessary caution, citing layered protection, citing low exposure windows, citing assurances that the device posed no immediate threat, and he recognized the pattern, the narrowing of concern to justify continuity. And he responded only by restating that transmission plus child proximity triggered mandatory elevation under safeguarding protocols, a clause rarely invoked because it complicated everything it touched. And the room shifted again, command officials exchanging looks that carried calculation rather than disagreement, because invoking that clause would force reporting beyond their immediate control. And one of them asked, quietly, whether the guard was prepared to justify that escalation in writing, and he answered that he already was, submitting his log in real time. And the quiet that followed was heavier than argument, broken only by the muted hum of equipment as the signal was partially dampened but not neutralized. And when the Queen's departure finally proceeded in the replacement vehicle, the guard remained behind, assigned to incident continuity rather than escort, an assignment that felt less like discipline and more like containment. And as the motorcade cleared the bay, the pressure condensed into procedural requests, for summaries, for verbal briefings, for reassurance that the matter would be resolved internally, and the guard complied with each without softening his language, sticking to observation and fact. And when he was asked, almost casually, whether he believed the device was intended for the child rather than the Queen, he did not speculate, stating only that placement beneath the rear seat rail optimized concealment across occupants, and that answer closed one avenue of dismissal because it refused the comfort of misdirection, and the command officer nodded slowly, signaling that further discussion would move upstairs, away from technicians and logs, into offices where decisions were framed as interpretations. And as the guard prepared to follow, he sent one more request through secure channels, flagging the child's schedule for temporary isolation until clearance was complete, and the confirmation came back delayed but affirmative, a small procedural victory that carried weight beyond its wording. And as he left the bay, the lights dimmed behind him, sealing the compromised vehicle in shadow, and he understood that the next phase would not involve devices or engines, but paper, authorization codes, and the quiet insistence of orders that assumed compliance, and he adjusted his pace accordingly, because pressure had shifted from physical space to hierarchy, and instinct told him that what had been found was less dangerous than who had allowed it to be there. The office level above the motor bay was quieter by design, carpet absorbing sound, temperature regulated to a neutrality that made long conversations feel shorter than they were, and the guard was led into a conference room without ceremony, asked to sit, then left standing for several minutes as others arrived in sequence, each entrance measured, each presence calibrated. And when the briefing began, it did so without accusation, framed as clarification, a need to understand why escalation thresholds had been crossed, why safeguarding clauses had been invoked so early, and the guard answered methodically, drawing from his logs rather than memory, timestamps anchoring each decision. And when the signal trace was displayed on the wall, the room leaned in almost imperceptibly, because the encryption markers were unmistakable, not civilian, not external, but structured to align with internal security architecture. And that detail shifted the questioning, narrowing it, as someone asked whether the device could have been placed during authorized maintenance, and the guard acknowledged the possibility, while noting that maintenance access logs showed no unaccounted windows, and that the adhesive used was not standard issue. And the room absorbed this without reaction, moving instead toward process, toward who had clearance to approve non-standard tracking, and the answer came indirectly, through a chart that displayed authorization pathways, most of them terminating in dead ends, one of them highlighted in a muted color that drew the eye without calling attention, and the guard recognized the implication before it was spoken, that the approval token tied to the signal matched a senior authority's override code, one used sparingly, designed for extraordinary circumstances and never intended to bypass child protection safeguards. And the quiet that followed was the office level above the motor bay was quieter by design, carpet absorbing sound, temperature regulated to a neutrality that made long conversations feel shorter than they were, and the guard was led into a conference room without ceremony, asked to sit, then left standing for several minutes as others arrived in sequence, each entrance measured, each presence calibrated. And when the briefing began, it did so without accusation, framed as clarification, a need to understand why escalation thresholds had been crossed, why safeguarding clauses had been invoked so early, and the guard answered methodically, drawing from his logs rather than memory, timestamps anchoring each decision. And when the signal trace was displayed on the wall, the room leaned in almost imperceptibly, because the encryption markers were unmistakable, not civilian, not external, but structured to align with internal security architecture. And that detail shifted the questioning, narrowing it, as someone asked whether the device could have been placed during authorized maintenance, and the guard acknowledged the possibility, while noting that maintenance access logs showed no unaccounted windows, and that the adhesive used was not standard issue. And the room absorbed this without reaction, moving instead toward process, toward who had clearance to approve non-standard tracking, and the answer came indirectly, through a chart that displayed authorization pathways, most of them terminating in dead ends, one of them highlighted in a muted color that drew the eye without calling attention, and the guard recognized the implication before it was spoken, that the approval token tied to the signal matched a senior authority's override code, one used sparingly, designed for extraordinary circumstances and never intended to bypass child protection safeguards. And the quiet that followed was not shock, but recalibration, as if the room collectively adjusted to a new center of gravity. And when the guard asked whether that override had been logged, the answer was careful, stating that the authorization existed, but the justification field was sealed pending review, and he felt the weight of that omission settle, because sealed fields were not errors, but decisions, and as discussion shifted toward resolution strategies, he noted how language softened around the authority in question, how phrases like misapplication and procedural drift replaced more direct terms, and when a directive was issued suggesting the matter be contained within internal audit until clarity was achieved, the guard requested that his documentation be preserved in original form, unedited, and that request was met with a pause that carried risk, because preservation implied exposure beyond intent. The response to his request came as a compromise, preservation acknowledged but access restricted, and the guard accepted the terms while initiating a parallel safeguard he did not announce, duplicating his logs through a secure evidentiary channel reserved for incidents involving minors, a channel that triggered oversight automatically rather than by invitation. And as the meeting continued, he felt the pressure sharpen, no longer diffuse but focused, as questions were posed about his judgment, about whether he had considered the reputational impact of misinterpretation, about the balance between vigilance and overreach, and he answered each without defensiveness, returning always to observable facts, to transmission confirmed, to encryption matched, to child proximity documented, and when a direct order was finally issued suggesting he step back from the incident pending further review, it was phrased as concern for his objectivity, and he complied in form while clarifying that evidence custody would remain intact and that any further action involving the compromised vehicle or the child's transport would require his written acknowledgement or formal override. And that clarification landed heavily because it transformed the order from quiet sidelining into a recorded decision point, and the senior official issuing it hesitated just long enough for the guard to see the calculation behind the eyes, the awareness that overrides left trails, and the meeting adjourned shortly after, tension unresolved but contained within procedural walls. And as the guard left the room, he noticed the subtle increase in surveillance presence in the corridor, an extra uniform, a camera angle adjusted, not aggressive but attentive, and he understood that scrutiny had shifted to him as much as to the device. And yet the confirmation ping that reached his secure channel minutes later told him what mattered most, that the child's schedule remained isolated, flagged pending review, and that small status line steadied his pace, because whatever authority had misused its reach had not yet reclaimed ground. And as evening settled over the palace, lights dimming in controlled phases, the guard reviewed his logs alone, checking for precision rather than justification, knowing that the next phase would test not his vigilance but his restraint, because the pressure now was not to act but to stand still while others decided whether the line he had drawn would be erased or enforced. The decision to reroute came without announcement, embedded in a routine update that shifted vehicles, times, and personnel under the guise of efficiency, and the guard observed it from the operations floor, where movement was tracked as data rather than bodies, the child's identifier replaced by a neutral code that nonetheless remained static, isolated from the rest of the schedule. And that stillness mattered, because it meant the safeguard held, at least for now. And as the compromised vehicle was transferred to a sealed bay under joint custody, the guard was reassigned again, this time not away but adjacent, placed where he could observe without commanding, a position that demanded patience rather than action, and the pressure returned in quieter forms, a request to provide verbal context to an oversight liaison, a suggestion that his written logs might benefit from interpretive framing, an offer of relief from duty that carried the implication of exhaustion rather than strategy, and he declined each gently, citing continuity, maintaining presence through compliance rather than refusal. And when the liaison reviewed the authorization trail, the guard noted the careful neutrality of the questions, focused on systems rather than individuals, on how an override could exist without triggering alerts, and the answer unfolded slowly, revealing a legacy access structure never fully reconciled with newer safeguarding layers, a vulnerability that required trust to function and silence to persist. And the guard listened, hands folded, because this was no longer about proving intent, but about preventing repetition. And as evening deepened, the palace corridors thinned, sound dampened by design, and the child was quietly relocated to a secure residence wing with no ceremony, no visible disruption, escorted by personnel who understood the weight of discretion. And the guard watched the transfer from a distance, noting the absence of fear in the child's posture, the ordinary cadence of protected routine preserved. And that outcome justified the hours of pressure more than any acknowledgement could. Yet the matter was not closed, because the authority tied to the override had not been named aloud, only circled, and the guard sensed the institutional instinct to resolve without rupture, to correct without exposure, and he prepared for the possibility that accountability would be procedural rather than personal. And as reports were compiled and cross-checked, he ensured that his documentation remained factual, resisting the urge to embellish, because exaggeration weakened credibility. And when the device was finally removed under controlled conditions, its internals confirmed long-term deployment intent rather than immediate threat, reinforcing the conclusion that the risk had been cumulative, normalized, and therefore more dangerous. And the guard filed that finding with the same restraint as the rest, aware that restraint itself was a form of pressure, because it denied others the excuse of emotion. The final departure occurred later than planned, under adjusted routing that avoided attention, and the guard was present not at the front, but along the perimeter, observing rather than leading. And when the motorcade cleared the gate, there was no sense of triumph, only completion, because success in this context was defined by absence, by nothing happening. And in the days that followed, the resolution unfolded quietly, an internal review announced without detail, access privileges revised, override codes audited, and the authority in question reassigned under the language of role realignment rather than censure, a choice that reflected the institution's preference for continuity. And the guard noted it without comment, because the child's protection had been maintained, and the mechanism that allowed misuse had been narrowed, and those outcomes mattered more than symbolism. And when he was finally called into a brief closing meeting, it was to confirm that his actions aligned with safeguarding mandates, that no further review of his conduct was required, and that his documentation would be retained as reference. And the acknowledgment was delivered without praise, professional and contained, and he accepted it the same way he accepted orders, as part of the structure he served. And afterward his routine resumed, shifts blending into one another, the palace returning to its measured rhythms, yet the memory of the thin adhesive pad beneath the seat rail remained precise, a reminder that threats did not announce themselves loudly, that authority could drift into misuse without malice, and that protocol was only as strong as the instinct to question its gaps. And when he passed the motor bay weeks later, the lighting was unchanged, the concrete still cool, but the procedures had been subtly altered, an extra verification step added, a safeguard embedded where silence once was. And the guard walked on without lingering, because his role was not to watch the impact of his decisions, but to be ready for the next irregularity, knowing now that holding the line was not a single act, but a posture maintained, quietly, until it was no longer needed, or until someone else noticed what should not have been there.